Alara moved nimbly across the slick surface of what had once been a skyscraper's rooftop, now just barely emerging from the churning sea. Her slight frame belied the strength in her limbs, honed by years of climbing through the half-submerged ruins that had once been a thriving coastal metropolis. The city had no name anymore, at least none that mattered. To survivors like her, it was simply another hunting ground, a place to scavenge before the waters claimed it completely. The air hung heavy with salt and decay, a constant reminder of the great rising that had swallowed coastlines worldwide decades ago. Scientists had warned for generations, but nobody expected the catastrophic ice shelf collapse that sent sea levels surging almost overnight. What remained now was a drowned world where humanity clung to existence in scattered pockets, fighting against nature that had evolved with frightening speed to reclaim man's domain. Alara paused, crouching to examine the bioluminescent patterns swirling beneath the water surface. The kelp vines glowed an ethereal blue-green, beautiful from a distance but deadly up close. She'd seen what those tendrils could do, how they could wrap around limbs with surprising strength, constricting until the victim's energy was slowly drained away. The mutation had appeared in the years following the rising. Ordinary kelp transformed by some combination of radiation, chemical runoff, and nature's ruthless adaptation. "Not today," she whispered, charting a path around the densest growth. Her voice sounded strange even to her own ears. She hadn't spoken aloud to another person in weeks, not since losing her small gathering crew to a miscalculated expedition into the financial district. The memory still burned. Marcus disappearing beneath swirling waters, Zoe's scream cut short by a collapsing facade, Tomas taken by something large and fast that left only ripples behind. She'd barely escaped herself, and the survivor's guilt weighed on her like the waterlogged pack on her shoulders. But today's objective was worth the risk. Intelligence from traders at the last floating outpost suggested this building housed an old data center, one that had been hardened against natural disasters before the rising. If she could access it, the payoff could be enormous. Maps of elevated terrain, coordinates of surviving inland communities, or technology that could be bartered for months of supplies. In a world where information was as valuable as clean water, this could change everything. The entrance she sought appeared just as the tide hit its lowest point. A maintenance door, half submerged but accessible. Alara checked her makeshift rebreather, a contraption of salvage parts that would give her about 15 minutes underwater if needed. Not long, but hopefully enough. She secured her knife and the waterproof torch before carefully lowering herself into the brackish water. The coolness enveloped her as she eased toward the door, careful to disturb the surface as little as possible. Anything could be watching. The waters teemed with evolved predators that had developed a taste for human flesh. She reached the door and found it partially open, jammed with debris. Using her knife, she cautiously cleared enough space to slip through, then pulled herself into the dark corridor beyond. Water dripped from her lean body as she stood, switching on her torch. The beam cut through darkness, revealing a maintenance hallway with pipes running along the ceiling. The air was stale but breathable. So far, so good. 3 steps in, she felt it, a slight tug at her ankle. Before she could react, something shot upward from the water behind her, wrapping around her calf with surprising force. Alara gasped, the torch beam swinging wildly as she reached for a knife. In that moment of illumination, she saw the hallway wasn't empty as she'd thought. Tendrils of kelp vines had infiltrated through cracks and flooded sections, creeping along walls and ceiling in a ghostly network. The vine around her ankle tightened, joined by another that snaked around her wrist, knocking the knife from her grasp. It clattered away into the darkness as more tendrils emerged, seemingly responding to her struggles. Their bioluminescence intensified, casting the corridor in an eerie blue glow as they encircled her torso, arms, and legs. Alara fought with desperate strength, but each movement only seemed to trigger more vines to join the attack. The constriction tightened across her chest, making every breath a struggle. She could feel an unsettling coldness spreading from where they touched her skin, the sensation of her energy being siphoned away. "Help!" she screamed, though the rational part of her mind knew it was futile. Nobody ventured this close to the drowned zones alone. Nobody except her. "Please, somebody." Her voice echoed down the flooded corridor and out through the open door, carried across the water's surface before being swallowed by the constant sound of waves against concrete and the keening cries of mutated seabirds circling above. But someone did hear. Half a mile away, on a makeshift rig cobbled together from shipping containers and the remains of fishing vessel, Cale paused in his work. His weathered hands stilled on the netting he was repairing, head tilting slightly. Years of solitude had sharpened his senses, a necessity for survival when you chose to live where no one else dared. The sound came again, fainter this time, but unmistakably human. A cry for help. Cale frowned, setting aside the netting. His instinct was to ignore it. He'd learned the hard way that altruism was a luxury few could afford in this world. Every stranger was a potential threat, every rescue a risk. But something in that voice, the raw desperation, tugged at something he'd thought long buried beneath layers of pragmatism and painful memories. "Damn it," he muttered, running a hand through his salt-stiffened hair. He moved with the efficiency of someone accustomed to solitude, gathering essentials with practiced motions, a specialized machete designed to cut through kelp vines, a low-frequency sonic emitter that could temporarily stun the more aggressive marine life, a medical kit that had seen better days. His rig was a testament to resourcefulness. Solar panels salvaged from luxury yachts, a rainwater collection system, even a small garden of salt-resistant crops grown in containers. Everything essential, nothing wasted. It was a lonely existence, but one that had kept him alive when entire communities had succumbed to rising waters, disease, or the predators that evolved in the aftermath. Cale lowered himself into a small, aluminum boat tethered to the rig. The outboard motor was a precious commodity, used only when absolutely necessary to conserve the biofuel he distilled himself. This qualified. He pulled the starter cord, and the engine sputtered to life, drowning out the whispers in his mind that told him this was foolish, that he should mind his own business. He navigated the maze of partially submerged skyscrapers with the confidence of someone who'd mapped every hazard, steering toward the source of the cry. The buildings loomed like tombstones in a flooded graveyard, windows gaping like empty eye sockets, watching his progress with indifference. The cry didn't come again, but he was certain of its origin, a glass and steel structure that had once housed some financial company whose name was now just faded letters on the facade. As he approached, the boat's hull scraped against something beneath the surface. Cale killed the engine immediately, recognizing the telltale glow of kelp vines spreading beneath him like a luminous web. "Careful now," he whispered to himself, taking up the oars to maneuver the final distance. Silence was essential. Sound traveled across water, and there were things that hunted by noise alone in these ruins. He secured the boat to a protruding window frame, then paused, listening intently. At first, there was only the gentle lapping of waves against concrete and the distant cry of some aerial predator. Then he heard it, faint but distinct, the sound of struggle from within the building. Cale readied his machete and slipped into the water, moving with deliberate care to avoid disturbing the kelp vines spreading beneath the surface. He found a maintenance entrance easily enough, partially open, with clear signs of recent passage. Taking a deep breath, he ducked inside. The scene that greeted him was both beautiful and horrifying. The corridor glowed with ethereal blue-green light, illuminating a young woman suspended in a web of writhing vines. They had wrapped around every limb, her torso, even beginning to encircle her neck. Her struggles had weakened to feeble twitches, her skin unnaturally pale where it wasn't marred by the purplish-red marks left by the constricting tendrils. Cale acted without hesitation. He activated the sonic emitter first, its low-frequency pulses causing the vines to momentarily recoil. In that brief window, He began slashing with the specialized machete, its serrated edge designed to sever the tough, fibrous kelp vines. Each cut released a phosphorescent fluid that splashed across his arms, burning like ice where it touched bare skin. The vines responded to the attack with unexpected coordination, releasing their victim to focus on this new threat. Cale found himself fighting against an increasing number of tendrils that seemed to emerge from every crack and crevice. He maintained his position between the fallen woman and the most aggressive growth, systematically cutting through the primary nodes where multiple vines connected. "Stay with me," he called to her, though he wasn't sure she could still hear him. Her body had slumped to the floor when released, unnaturally still except for the shallow rise and fall of her chest. One particularly thick vine whipped toward his face with surprising speed. Cale ducked, but not quite fast enough. It caught him across the cheek, leaving a burning welt. He responded by driving the machete directly into what appeared to be the central mass of the growth, twisting with all his strength. The effect was immediate and unsettling. The entire network of vines convulsed, the bioluminescence flaring briefly before dimming. The tendrils withdrew into the cracks and waterlogged sections, as if retreating to lick their wounds. Cale knew it was temporary. The kelp vines would regenerate and return, possibly more aggressive than before. They seemed to learn from each encounter. He sheathed the machete and knelt beside the woman. Her pulse was weak but present, her skin cold to the touch. The distinctive marks left by the vines, similar to frostbite, but with spidery patterns following the path of veins beneath the skin, covered her arms and neck. Without treatment, those could develop into necrotic tissue within days. "Hey," he said, gently patting her cheek. "We need to move. Now." Her eyelids fluttered, revealing dilated pupils that struggled to focus on his face. Recognition of another human being seemed to penetrate the fog of her semi-consciousness, and she jerked away in sudden fear. "Easy," Cale said, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. "Those things were killing you. We need to get out of here before they regroup." She tried to speak, but could only manage a weak cough. Understanding the urgency, she attempted to stand, only for her legs to buckle beneath her. Without asking permission, Cale scooped her up. She was lighter than she looked, too light, another sign of the energy drain from prolonged contact with the vines. The return to the boat was tense but uneventful. Cale placed her carefully in the bottom of the vessel before untying it and pushing off from the building. Only when they were safely away from the densest concentration of kelp vines did he risk starting the motor again. As they navigated back through the labyrinth of drowned skyscrapers, the woman drifted in and out of consciousness. Cale kept one eye on her and another on their surroundings. The afternoon was waning, and darkness in the flooded zones brought dangers of its own. His rig appeared on the horizon, a patchwork structure rising from the water, neither beautiful nor elegant, but undeniably impressive in its functionality. Solar panels gleamed dully in the fading light, while a complex array of nets, traps, and deterrents surrounded the base to keep aquatic predators at bay. Cale docked the boat in a small protected inlet built into the rig structure, then carefully lifted the woman onto the main platform. She stirred slightly, murmuring something incoherent as he carried her inside the central living space. The interior of Cale's home reflected the same pragmatic approach as the exterior. Everything served a purpose, from the hammock-style bed that swayed gently with the rig's movement to the walls lined with salvage technology, tools, and supplies. The only concession to comfort was a small shelf holding a few dog-eared books, relics from the world before. He laid her on a pallet of clean blankets, then set about gathering what he needed. Purified water, antiseptic made from distilled alcohol and seaweed extract, and a salve he developed specifically for kelp vine injuries after his own early encounters with them. The woman's eyes opened as he knelt beside her, confusion giving way to alarm as she tried to scramble backward. "Where am I? Who are you?" Her voice was hoarse, but carried a steel undertone that suggested she wasn't accustomed to feeling vulnerable. "My name's Cale," he replied simply, setting the supplies down where she could see them. "You were caught by kelp vines in that data center. I heard you call for help." She stared at him with unmasked suspicion, eyes darting around the space, likely assessing threats and exits. Exactly what he would do. Good instincts. Why would you help me? The question held no gratitude, only wariness. Kale shrugged. Heard you screaming. Figured no one deserves to die like that. He gestured to the marks on her arms. Those need treatment. Oh, but they'll get worse. I'm not going to hurt you, but I won't stop you if you want to leave. Her gaze moved to the fading light visible through the single reinforced window. They both knew what prowled the waters after dark. Alara, she said finally. My name is Alara. It was a small concession, but Kale nodded in acknowledgement. Those vines took a lot out of you. You need water, food, and rest, in that order. He pushed a container of clear water toward her. This is clean, collected from rain, then filtered. Alara hesitated only briefly before taking the container. Clean water was perhaps the most valuable commodity in the flooded zones, and the fact that he'd offer it so readily said something about either his resources or his character. She drank slowly, with the discipline of someone who knew the dangers of gulping water after deprivation. When she'd finished, she set the container down and extended her arms, examining the damage with clinical detachment. I've seen these before. On Marcus, before she trailed off, then looked up with renewed suspicion. You have medicine for this? Kale nodded. Made it myself. Trial and error, mostly. He rolled up his sleeve to reveal similar scarring on his forearm, though faded with time. It works. Burns like hell, though. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. Everything does these days. This small shared understanding eased some of the tension. Kale showed her the salve, a greenish paste with a pungent odor, and demonstrated how to apply it to one of the smaller marks on her wrist. She winced at the initial sting, but didn't pull away. I can do the rest, she said, taking the container from him. Kale nodded and moved away to give her privacy, busying himself with preparing a simple meal of dried fish and cultivated sea greens. The silence between them was not comfortable, but it had lost some of its hostile edge. As night fell in earnest, the sounds outside changed. The gentle lapping of waves gave way to occasional splashes, some large enough to suggest creatures of considerable size moving beneath the surface. Faint, eerie calls echoed across the water, the hunting cries of gloom stalkers, amphibious predators that had evolved from mundane frogs into something far more nightmarish. Alara had finished treating her injuries and sat with her back against the wall, watching Kale with the wariness of a cornered animal. He placed a portion of food near her, then retreated to his own space. Thank you, she said finally, the words sounding rusty, as if rarely used. For pulling me out of there. Kale nodded once, a terse acknowledgement. What were you looking for in that building? Not many venture that deep into the drown zones alone. Alara considered him for a long moment, clearly weighing how much to reveal. Information, she finally said. That building housed a data center for the Coastal Authority before the rising. They had detailed hydrographic maps, projections of the changing sea levels, safe routes through dangerous currents. And you need these because my group was looking for higher ground, somewhere stable to establish a more permanent settlement. Pain flashed across her face. We had heard rumors of elevated areas inland that remained unaffected by the rising, with soil still capable of supporting crops. Your group, Kale repeated. The past tense hadn't escaped his notice. Alara's gaze dropped to her food. They didn't make it. A miscalculation about the stability of a structure we were exploring. I was the only one who got out. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken grief. Kale recognized the burden she carried. He'd seen it in his own reflection often enough. I'm sorry, he said simply. A sudden impact against the side of the rig interrupted the moment. The entire structure shuddered, water sloshing against the supports beneath them. Alara jumped to her feet despite her weakened state, hand going instinctively to where her knife would have been. Gloomstalkers, Kale explained, already moving toward a locker built into the wall. He extracted what looked like a modified harpoon gun. They get bold when they hunt in packs. Another impact, stronger this time, rocked the rig. Through the window, They could see bioluminescent eyes glowing just above the waterline. At least 3 pairs, possibly more lurking beneath the surface. They're drawn to movement and light, Cale said, positioning himself near the window. Usually they just test the defenses and move on, but sometimes a massive form launched itself from the water, slamming against the reinforced glass with enough force to create a spiderweb of cracks. For a brief, terrifying moment, they glimpsed what the Gloom Stalkers had become, a monstrous fusion of amphibian and something else, with elongated limbs ending in web claws and a distended jaw filled with needle-like teeth. Sometimes they're persistent, Cale finished grimly, raising the harpoon gun. Alara had recovered from her initial shock and was scanning the room. What can I do? Cabinet to your left. There's a sonic deterrent. Black cylinder with a red trigger. It'll disorient them temporarily. She moved quickly despite her injuries, retrieving the device. Another impact shook the structure, and this time, a different section of wall creaked ominously. They're coordinating, Cale muttered. Testing different points. Working together with minimal communication, they positioned themselves at opposite sides of the main space. When the next attack came, a massive body slamming against a lower section, Alara activated the sonic deterrent. The effect was immediate, thrashing water and high-pitched keening as the creatures recoiled from the painful sound waves. In that moment of confusion, Cale fired the harpoon through a specialized port in the wall. There was a shriek, followed by frenzied splashing. The water around the rig churned as the wounded stalker became the target of its own pack, a feeding frenzy erupting in seconds. The attacks on the rig ceased as quickly as they had begun, the remaining stalkers focusing on the easier prey. Cale reloaded the harpoon gun nonetheless, his movements mechanical, born of experience. They'll be gone soon, he said, but we should reinforce that cracked window before the next tide. Alara was already examining the damage, her mind shifting seamlessly from survival to repair. You have sealant? I can fix this. At his surprised look, she added, I wasn't always just a scavenger. Before the waters rose, I was studying structural engineering. A faint expression that might have been respect crossed Cale's face. Cabinet by the door. Blue container. They worked side by side in focused silence, reinforcing the damaged window with a combination of sealant and salvaged metal plating. The physical task created a different kind of interaction between them, cooperative, purposeful, each recognizing and respecting the other's competence. When they finished, Alara sagged suddenly, the adrenaline that had sustained her giving way to exhaustion. Cale steadied her with a hand on her elbow, guiding her back to the pallet of blankets. Rest, he said. I'll keep watch. Too drained to argue, she eased herself down, but her eyes remained on him, still not fully trusting. Why do you live out here alone? There are settlements, trading posts. Cale moved to his workbench, his back to her as he methodically cleaned and checked the harpoon gun. For a long moment, Alara thought he wouldn't answer. I was part of a floating community, he finally said, his voice flat. 300 people on connected barges and ships. We called it New Harbor. Alara's eyes widened slightly. I've heard of it. It was supposed to be one of the most successful adaptive settlements on the eastern seaboard. It was. The 2 words carried the weight of unbearable loss. Until it wasn't. She waited, sensing there was more he needed to say, even if he didn't want to. I was head of security, responsible for keeping everyone safe from what the rising brought with it. His hand stilled on the weapon. We'd survived storms, raids from desperate outsiders, even a first wave of marine mutations. Started to believe we'd figured it out, how to adapt, how to thrive. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the gentle creaking of the rig and the distant sounds of the ocean. What happened? Alara finally asked softly. Hubris. Complacency. Cale's shoulders tensed. A new strain of kelp vines attached to our flotilla's underside. By the time we realized the danger, they'd compromised the structural integrity of 3 primary barges. When a storm hit, he shook his head. I got 37 people on a lifeboats. The rest, including my wife and daughter, went down with New Harbor. The pain in his voice was raw, unhealed despite the passage of time. Alara recognized it because it mirrored her own, the survivor's burden, the endless cycle of what if and if only. "It wasn't your fault," she said, knowing the words were inadequate even as she spoke them. Cale turned, his expression closed once more. "Get some sleep. Tomorrow we can discuss your data center." Alara wanted to say more, but recognized the wall he'd erected. She nodded instead, settling into the blankets, as Cale took up position by the window, staring out at the dark waters that had taken everything from him. Dawn broke in shades of toxic beauty, pinks and oranges reflecting off waters that concealed as many dangers as wonders. Alara woke to find Cale already active, checking the rig's various systems and preparing what appeared to be a breakfast of some kind. Her body ached, the kelp vine marks throbbing beneath the layer of medicine, but she felt stronger than the previous evening. She rose, wincing slightly, and made her way to where a basin of clean water waited. The simple luxury of washing her face felt profound after yesterday's ordeal. "How's the pain?" Cale asked without looking up from the small stove where he was heating something that smelled surprisingly appetizing. "Manageable." She examined the marks on her arms, noting they had already begun to fade from angry red to a dull purple. "Your medicine works." He nodded, then handed her a bowl containing a porridge-like substance flecked with dried fruit, a rare treat in the post-rising world. "Eat. You'll need your strength if we're going back to that data center." Alara paused with the spoon halfway to her mouth. Unless you'd prefer to face those vines alone again." His tone was matter-of-fact, but there was a challenge in his eyes. She studied him, trying to decipher his motivations. "Why would you help me? You've already saved my life once. That's more than most would do these days." Cale was silent for a moment, seemingly focused on his own meal. "Your maps," he finally said. "If they exist, they'd be valuable to have. Knowledge of safe routes, elevated terrain, that's worth the risk." It was logical, pragmatic even, but Alara sensed there was more. Perhaps helping her with her mission offered some small redemption for those he couldn't save before. Or maybe, like her, he'd simply grown tired of surviving without purpose. "We need to wait for low tide again," she said, accepting his offer without further question. "And we should be better prepared this time." They spent the morning planning and preparing. Cale shared his knowledge of the local tidal patterns and the behaviors of the various creatures that had claimed the drowned zones as their territory. Alara detailed what she knew about the data center's layout from her initial exploration and what she'd learned about kelp vines from previous encounters. Together, they modified equipment, strengthening Alara's rebreather, preparing specialized cutting tools, and adapting Cale's sonic emitter to better target the specific frequency that seemed to disorient the vines. The data cores would be in the central server room, Alara explained as they studied a rough map she'd drawn on a salvaged piece of plastic sheeting. If they were properly sealed and the backup power systems worked as designed, there's a chance they're still intact. And if they're not? Cale asked, testing the edge of a curved blade designed specifically for severing the thickest vine nodes. Alara's face hardened with determination. Then we find another way. These coordinates exist somewhere. The rising wasn't a complete surprise to everyone. The authorities had projections, contingency plans. They knew which areas would remain above water. Cale nodded, understanding the stakes. In a world where dry, arable land was perhaps the most precious resource, such information could mean the difference between mere survival and actually rebuilding something meaningful. As midday approached, they loaded their equipment into Cale's boat. The tide was beginning its retreat, creating the optimal window for their expedition. The weather remained clear, another small mercy in a world that offered few. "One more thing," Cale said as they prepared to depart. He handed Alara a small device that resembled an old-fashioned compass. "Emergency beacon. If we get separated, activate it. It's keyed to a receiver on the rig." The simple gesture spoke volumes. It was an acknowledgement that, at least for now, they were a team. Alara clipped it to her belt without comment, but something in her posture relaxed slightly. The journey back to the data center was tense, but uneventful. They approached from a different angle this time, Kale guiding the boat through channels that minimize their exposure to the larger congregations of kelp vines visible beneath the surface. They secured the boat to a different entry point, a broken window on an upper level that would allow them to approach the server room from above rather than through the flooded corridors where Alara had been trapped. "Ready?" Kale asked as they prepared to enter. Alara checked her knife, rebreather, and a modified cutting tool before nodding. "Let's find those cores." The interior of the building was even more unsettling in daylight, as weak sunshine filtered through broken windows and water-stained ceilings, casting dappled patterns across surfaces covered in mold and the early stages of kelp vine infiltration. They moved carefully, testing each step on waterlogged floors that creaked ominously beneath their weight. Alara took the lead, her memory of the building's layout guiding them through a maze of offices and maintenance corridors. Kale followed close behind, constantly scanning for threats, one hand always near his weapons. They encountered smaller clusters of kelp vines, but nothing like the coordinated mass that had trapped Alara. These they dispatched efficiently, working in tandem. Alara identifying key nodes while Kale severed them with precision strikes from the specialized blades. They're more developed on the lower levels, Alara observed as they descended a stairwell that thankfully remained above the waterline, like they're growing upward from where they first infiltrated. Kale nodded, spreading toward the light, but also toward power sources. He pointed to a cluster of vines that had wrapped around what appeared to be an electrical junction box. They feed on energy any kind it can find. This insight proved valuable as they continued deeper into the building. By avoiding active power conduits and following the less dense growth patterns, they made better progress than expected. The server room, when they finally reached it, was both a relief and a new challenge. The reinforced door stood partially open, jammed by debris but accessible. Inside, row upon row of server racks stretched into shadow-filled depths, many still intact despite years of neglect. There, Alara whispered, pointing to a central console that appeared to have been specially protected, a glass-enclosed unit with its own power system. That would house the main data cores for critical infrastructure information. They approached cautiously, aware that the relative preservation of this room might indicate a larger threat. They weren't wrong. As they neared the central console, a soft glow began to emanate from behind the racks, a pulsing, hypnotic blue-green that indicated kelp vines of significant size. But these were different. Instead of spreading in chaotic patterns, they had formed around what appeared to be a central mass, a pulsating node nearly 5 feet in diameter that had fused with the building's backup power system. "Mother node," Kale breathed, instinctively stepping in front of Alara. "I've only seen one before, right before New Harbor fell." The mass seemed to sense their presence. Tendrils quivered, and the bioluminescence intensified, casting their shadows in sharp relief against the walls. A low vibration filled the air, more felt than heard, raising the hair on their arms. "The data cores," Alara said, voice tight with tension. "They're behind it." Kale assessed the situation with the cool calculation of someone who'd faced death many times. "Sonic emitter first, then we move fast. I'll draw its attention while you get to the console. Don't stop, don't hesitate, grab what you need and get out." Alara wanted to object to him putting himself at risk, but she knew he was right. His experience with these creatures exceeded hers, and her technical knowledge made her the logical choice to retrieve the data. "On my mark," Kale said, readying the emitter. 3, 2, 1. Now, he activated the device, sending pulses of disruptive sound waves toward the mother node. The effect was immediate and violent. The entire mass convulsed, tendrils whipping frantically as Kale moved laterally, drawing the creature's focus away from the console. Alara sprinted forward, vaulting over a fallen server rack and sliding beneath a cluster of reactive vines. She reached the console as Kale engaged the more aggressive tendrils with his cutting tools, a dance of blade and vine that required all his concentration and skill. The console was locked, but Alara had prepared for this. From her pack, she produced a small device, a universal bypass tool she'd salvaged from a security firm's headquarters months ago. The electronic lock resisted briefly before yielding with a soft click. Inside, protected by multiple layers of specialized casing, were the data cores, 3 rectangular units that contained potentially life-changing information. Alara worked feverishly to disconnect them, aware of the battle raging behind her. Kale was holding his own against the mother node, but just barely. For every tendril he severed, 2 more seemed to emerge from the central mass. A particularly vicious strike caught him across the shoulder, tearing through his protective clothing and drawing blood. He stumbled, but maintained his position between the creature and Alara. "Hurry," he called, voice strained with effort. Almost there. Alara had 2 cores free and was working on the third, the most securely connected and, likely, the most valuable. Her fingers worked deftly despite the pressure, disconnecting safety mechanisms and power feeds. The entire room shuddered suddenly, and a groan of stressed metal echoed through the building. The mother node's violent movements were compromising the already weakened structure. Water began to seep through cracks in the floor. The tide was turning, accelerating the danger. With a final twist, the third core came free. Alara secured all 3 in her pack and turned to find Kale backed against a server rack, fighting off increasingly coordinated attacks from the creature. "Kale," she shouted. "I've got them." He nodded grimly, then pulled something from his belt. A small explosive charge. "Get to the stairs. Now." Understanding his plan, Alara ran for the exit. Behind her, Kale waited until the last possible moment before embedding the charge deep in the mother node's central mass and sprinting after her. They had just reached the stairwell when the charge detonated. The explosion sent shockwaves through the entire floor, followed by the agonized writhing of the wounded mother node. Tendrils flailed wildly, smashing through walls and equipment in its death throes. "Move!" Kale shouted, pushing Alara ahead of him as the floor began to buckle beneath their feet. They raced upward, the sounds of destruction growing more intense behind them. Water rushed in through newly created breaches, filling corridors and rooms with frightening speed. The building itself seemed to groan in protest, decades of structural weakening finally giving way to catastrophic failure. Alara stumbled on a broken step, the weight of the data cores throwing her off balance. Kale caught her arm, steadying her without breaking stride. They moved in perfect synchronization now, all earlier suspicion forgotten in the desperate flight for survival. The window where they'd secured the boat was just ahead, a rectangle of daylight in the gloom. As they approached, a section of ceiling collapsed behind them, bringing a cascade of debris and seawater. The wave hit them from behind, propelling them forward with bruising force. Kale reached the window first, turning to help Alara through. His eyes widened suddenly. "Down!" he yelled, yanking her to the side as a massive tendril, the mother node's final desperate attack, punched through the space where she had just been standing. The vine quivered, seeming to sense them despite having no visible eyes. It moved with deadly purpose, sweeping across the room in search of its prey. Kale reached for his cutting tool, but had been lost in their flight. "The boat," Alara whispered, pointing to where their vessel rocked in the choppy waters just outside. "If we could just reach it." The tendril lunged suddenly, forcing them to dive in opposite directions. It struck the wall with enough force to crack the concrete, then recoiled for another attack. The building shuddered again, more severely this time, as the destruction below reached critical levels. "Go!" Kale shouted, picking up a broken pipe and swinging it at the tendril to draw its attention. "Get to the boat." Alara hesitated for only a fraction of a second before understanding his plan. She scrambled toward the window as Kale engaged the creature in a final, desperate battle. The tendril, focused on the more immediate threat, whipped toward him with lethal intent. Kale dodged the first strike, but wasn't fast enough to avoid the second. The vine caught him across the chest, slamming him against a wall with bone-jarring force. He slid to the floor, momentarily stunned, as the tendril reared back for a killing blow. Alara, halfway through the window, made a split-second decision. Instead of continuing to the boat, she pulled herself back into the room, drawing her knife, the one Cale had returned to her during their preparations. With a precise throw born of desperate necessity, she sent the blade spinning through the air. It struck perfectly, embedding itself in what appeared to be a sensitive node where the tendril connected to a larger mass. The vine convulsed violently, its bioluminescence flaring before dimming rapidly. In its thrashing, it struck a main support column, which gave way with a sound like a gunshot. "We're out of time," Elara gasped, pulling Cale to his feet as the entire room tilted ominously. Together they tumbled through the window, landing hard in the boat that had, miraculously, remained tethered despite the growing turbulence. Cale, despite his injuries, managed to start the motor as Elara cut the line with her recovered knife. They shot away from the disintegrating building just as it began a catastrophic collapse, massive sections falling into the water and creating waves that threatened to capsize their small vessel. Cale navigated with grim determination, his hands steady on the tiller despite the blood seeping through his torn clothing. Elara braced herself against the bow, the precious backpack containing the data cores clutched tightly to her chest. Behind them, the data center disappeared beneath the hungry waves, taking the wounded mother node with it. Only when they had put significant distance between themselves and the destruction did they allow themselves to breathe. The boat slowed to a more sustainable pace, conserving the precious fuel for the return journey to the rig. "Let me see," Elara said, moving carefully to Cale's side and gesturing to his injuries. He shook his head. "Later. We need to get back before dark." But Elara would not be deterred. "You're bleeding badly. We may not have a later if I don't at least stop that." With reluctant acquiescence, Cale allowed her to examine the wound. The tendril had torn through his protective clothing and left a deep gash across his chest and shoulder. Elara worked quickly, using supplies from the emergency kit to clean and bind the injury as best she could under the circumstances. "That was a stupid risk," Cale said as she worked, though there was no heat in his words. "Going back for me." Elara's hands stilled momentarily. So was setting off an explosive in an underwater building. She secured the bandage with practiced efficiency. "I guess we're both idiots." A ghost of a smile touched Cale's lips, perhaps the first genuine expression of warmth she had seen from him. It transformed his weathered face, hinting at the man he might have been before tragedy had carved its permanent lines into his features. The journey back to the rig was silent, but not uncomfortable. Each was lost in their own thoughts, processing what they had experienced and what might lie ahead. The enormity of what they had accomplished and nearly died for was just beginning to sink in. Cale's rig appeared on the horizon, still standing despite the increased wave activity from the distant collapse. As they approached, Elara noticed things she had missed in the previous day's trauma. The ingenious water purification system that utilized natural filtration, the small garden plots growing salt-resistant vegetation, the weather monitoring equipment cobbled together from salvage parts. This wasn't just a place of mere survival. It was a testament to human adaptability and resilience. They secured the boat and made their way onto the main platform, both moving more slowly now that the immediate danger had passed. The adrenaline crash left them exhausted, their injuries demanding attention that could no longer be postponed. Inside the main living space, Elara insisted on properly treating Cale's wounds before allowing him to examine the data cores. He submitted to her care with surprising docility, perhaps too drained to argue or perhaps recognizing the debt he now owed her for her unexpected return to save him. "Why did you do it?" he asked quietly as she applied the last of the antiseptic to a particularly deep cut. "You could have made it to the boat." The cores were secure. Elara's hands remained steady, though her voice carried an undertone of emotion she couldn't quite suppress. "I've already watched people die when I could have helped. I won't do it again." She secured the final bandage before meeting his gaze directly. "Not ever again, if I can help it." The simplicity and honesty of her answer seemed to satisfy him. When she had finished, he nodded once, a gesture that conveyed more gratitude than words could have expressed. They turned their attention to the data cores, carefully removing them from Elara's waterproof pack and placing them on the workbench. They were remarkably intact, sealed units designed to withstand exactly the kind of catastrophic environmental changes that had occurred. Can you access them? Kale asked, watching as Alara examined the connection ports on each unit. She nodded slowly. I think so. I have an adapter that should work with these models. From her own supplies, she produced a small device, a universal interface tool that had been standard equipment for tech operators before the Rising. If there's still charge in their internal batteries, we might be able to view the data directly. If not, we'll need to find a power source. Working methodically, she connected the adapter to the first core, then to a small tablet she extracted from a hidden pocket in her jacket. For a tense moment, nothing happened. Then the screen flickered to life, displaying an authentication request. This could be a problem, Alara murmured, fingers hovering over the display. These would have been top-level security clearance. Kale leaned closer, examining the prompt. Try Emergency Protocol Alpha. It was the override code for coastal defense systems during the early stages of the Rising. Alara gave him a surprised look. How would you know that? Before New Harbor, before everything changed, I was Coastal Guard. Security section. His expression darkened with memory. Not that it helped much when the real crisis hit. Alara entered the code, and after a heart-stopping pause, the screen cleared, revealing a directory of files. Her breath caught as she scrolled through the listings, detailed topographical maps, sea-level projections, evacuation routes, and most valuably, coordinates of sustainable inland regions with notations on resources, climate stability, and defensibility. It's all here, she whispered, a tremor entering her voice. Everything we hoped for. Look, these areas are marked as primary habitation candidates. Elevated plateaus, freshwater sources, arable land. Her finger traced a region several hundred miles inland. This could be it, Kale. This could be what everyone's been searching for. Kale's expression remained guarded, though his eyes reflected the same cautious hope kindling in Alara's heart. We should check the other cores. Make sure we have complete data before getting too excited. The second core contained more specific information, infrastructure that might have survived in these regions, pre-rising stockpiles of seeds and equipment, even contingency plans for re-establishing communication networks. The third, most securely protected core held detailed routes, not just general directions, but specific paths that accounted for changed waterways, unstable terrain, and known danger zones. As the full scope of what they had recovered became clear, Alara sank into a chair, overwhelmed. This wasn't just valuable information, it was potentially civilization-altering. The coordinates, routes, and resource data could mean the difference between humanity's continued precarious existence and the possibility of actually rebuilding something meaningful. We did it, she said softly, looking up at Kale with eyes bright with unshed tears. We actually did it. His response was more measured, tempered by years of disappointment and loss. Having a map doesn't mean the journey will be easy. I know that. Alara's voice strengthened with conviction. But it's more than we had yesterday. It's more than anyone has had since the waters rose. She gestured to the display, where one of the topographical maps showed expansive highlands with notations about seasonal rainfall patterns. This is worth fighting for, Kale. Worth risking everything for. He studied her face, seeing the determination there, a mirror of something he had perhaps once felt himself, before grief and survival had worn it away. You want to attempt this journey? Based on data that's years old, through territories no one has successfully navigated. Yes. The single word contained no hesitation. What's the alternative? Scavenging the drowned zones until luck runs out? Watching the waters rise a little more each year until there's nowhere left to stand. She leaned forward, intensity radiating from her slight frame. I've lost everyone, Kale. Everything. But I refuse to just survive until I can't anymore. I want to find something worth living for. Her words hung in the air between them, a challenge and an invitation. Kale turned away, moving to the rig's single window to stare out at the endless water that had become both home and prison. The silence stretched, filled only by the constant sounds of waves against the structure's supports. It would be suicide alone, he finally said, still facing the window. The inland routes would have changed with the rising waters. Predator territories have expanded. And there are human dangers too, desperate communities that wouldn't welcome strangers bringing news of better places. Alara waited, sensing he wasn't finished. You need someone who understands how to read changing water patterns. Someone who knows how to navigate both the environmental threats and the human ones. He turned back to face her, his expression unreadable. Someone with nothing left to lose. Hope flickered across Alara's face, quickly contained. Are you saying you'd come with me? I'm saying we both know you won't make it alone. And this, he gestured to the data displayed on the tablet, is too important to lose because of pride or stubbornness. It wasn't a passionate declaration of partnership, but coming from Kale, it might as well have been. Alara nodded, understanding the enormity of what he was offering. For a man who had chosen isolation as a shield against further loss, agreeing to join her on such a perilous journey represented a profound change. We'd need to prepare, she said, accepting his decision without fanfare, respecting the difficulty it must have cost him. Supplies, better weapons, a more suitable vessel for the initial water crossing. Kale nodded, already mentally cataloging what they would need. The northern route would be safest for the water portion, following the old coastal highway where the elevated sections still emerge at low tide. After that, we need to find one of the inland waterways that hasn't been claimed by the larger predators. They fell into planning with surprising ease, each contributing their knowledge and skills to the nascent expedition. As night fell, they continued working by lamplight, mapping possible routes on a salvage paper chart using the digital data as reference, listing necessary supplies, discussing potential challenges and solutions. It was only when exhaustion made further planning impossible that they finally rested. Alara settled onto her pallet of blankets, her mind racing despite her body's demand for sleep. Across the room, Kale took his usual position by the window, though his vigilance seemed less about suspicion now and more about ingrained habit. Kale, Alara said softly into the darkness. Thank you. Not just for today, but for... She struggled to articulate exactly what she was grateful for, the rescue, the partnership, or perhaps simply for being the one person who had heard her cry for help when all seemed lost. Get some sleep, he replied, his voice gentler than she had heard it before. We have a long journey ahead. Days passed in a flurry of preparation. The rig, which had been Kale's solitary home for years, was systematically disassembled, its most valuable components repurposed for their expedition. They modified a larger boat, a sturdy craft Kale had salvaged and kept in reserve, adding reinforced hulls to withstand debris and potential attacks from aquatic predators. Alara proved herself as resourceful as Kale had initially suspected, her engineering background allowing her to improve upon many of his designs. Together, they created specialized equipment, enhanced breathing apparatus for navigating fog-bound or toxic areas, modified weapons effective against both kelp vines and larger threats, and portable devices to access and reference the precious data they had recovered. Their partnership evolved through shared work and purpose. The initial wariness gave way to mutual respect, then to something approaching genuine trust, a rare and valuable commodity in the post-rising world. They learned each other's strengths and compensated for weaknesses without need for discussion, moving with the synchronicity of people who had worked together for years rather than days. During their preparations, they would occasionally spot other vessels in the distance, scavengers or traders navigating the channels between drowned skyscrapers. Always, they would halt their work and observe silently until the potential threat passed. Neither was ready to share their discovery or their plans with a wider world of survivors. The information they held was too valuable, too potentially world-changing to risk. On the seventh day, as they were securing the last of their supplies to the modified boat, a storm rolled in from the east, sudden and violent, as most weather had become after the rising, altered global patterns. They rushed to protect their equipment, battening down the remaining sections of the rig that wouldn't be coming with them. Huddled inside as lightning split the sky and waves crashed against their temporary home, they found themselves sharing stories they had previously kept guarded. Kale spoke more openly about New Harbor, not just its loss, but what it had been at its height, a community of survivors who had created something remarkable from the wreckage of the old world. He described his wife Lyra's garden of salt-resistant plants, their daughter Myra's fascination with the strange new marine life, the collective effort to build schools and systems that might preserve knowledge for a future they still believed in. Alara, in turn, shared the journey that had led her to the data center, how her small gathering crew had formed from the remnants of different collapsed communities, united by the rumor of highlands where the soil could still support traditional agriculture. Their leader, an older woman named Vesta, had once been a government researcher who spoke of classified contingency plans and data that could lead them to salvation. When Vesta was the first to fall during their ill-fated expedition, Alara had taken up the mission, driven by a promise to find what the older woman had believed existed. She was right, Alara said, gazing at the tablet where their planned route glowed in the dim light. Vesta was right all along. There are places that survived, just like she said. And we're going to find them, Kale replied, the statement carrying the weight of commitment rather than mere possibility. The storm passed by morning, leaving behind clearer skies than they had seen in weeks, as if nature itself was acknowledging their impending departure. They made final checks of their vessel and supplies, securing the data cores in a specially constructed waterproof case that would be kept with them at all times. Standing on what remained of the rig, the place that had been Kale's solitary fortress for so long, they surveyed the endless expanse of water stretching to the horizon. Somewhere beyond that boundary of sea and sky lay the highlands marked on their maps, the possible future they were risking everything to find. "Ready?" Alara asked, shouldering her pack. Kale took a final look around the dismantled rig, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded, something resolute settling in his features. "Ready." They boarded their vessel without ceremony, Kale taking position at the helm while Alara secured the last of their equipment. The modified engine came to life with a reassuring hum, more efficient and quieter than the small outboard they had used before. As they pulled away from the rig, neither looked back. Their focus was entirely forward, on the challenging journey ahead, on the landmarks they would need to identify, on the dangers they would face together. The rising sun cast long shadows across the water, illuminating their path eastward where the old coastal highway would provide their first navigational marker. Alara moved to stand beside Kale at the helm, her shoulder nearly touching his as they both gazed toward the horizon. The data cores, their precious cargo of hope, rested securely between them. They were no longer two solitary survivors struggling against an indifferent world, but partners bound by shared purpose and growing trust. The waters ahead would be treacherous, the inland territories unknown despite the maps they carried. They would face evolved predators, hostile human enclaves, and the ever-present challenge of finding clean water and food. The journey to the highlands might take weeks or months, with no guarantee of what they would find upon arrival. Yet as their boat cut through the water, leaving the drowned city behind, both felt something that had been absent for too long, a sense of possibility that extended beyond mere survival. The vines that had nearly claimed Alara's life had inadvertently created the partnership that might now lead to something greater. Somewhere in the distance, above the endless water and the ruins of the old world, the highlands waited. And for the first time since the rising changed everything, Alara and Kale allowed themselves to believe in a future worth finding together.